The kitchen still smelled like his coffee. That was the thing that struck Vera Calloway the hardest when she came downstairs that Tuesday morning. Not the silence, not the empty hook where his keys used to hang, not even the single mug sitting in the drying rack like a monument of routine. It was the smell. Dark roast, 2 sugars, the same blend he'd been buying from the same shop on Bloor Street for 11 years. She stood in the doorway in her socks and breathed it in and felt, for one weak and disorienting moment, like everything was fine. It wasn't fine. It hadn't been fine for a long time. She just hadn't let herself know that yet. Vera had met Connor Ashby at a property law seminar in downtown Toronto, back when she was still articling, and he was 2 years into his career as a structural engineer. He'd borrowed a pen from her and never given it back. She'd never asked for it. That was the kind of love it was. Easy to give things away, easy to pretend you hadn't noticed the loss. They were married at 31, in a small ceremony at a vineyard outside Niagara-on-the-Lake, with her mother crying in the front row, and his brother delivering a toast that went on 8 minutes too long. It was a good day. She still believed that. Even now, she still believed it had been a good day. But that was the thing about marriages that fall apart slowly. The good days don't disappear. They just get buried. Vera was 38 when she began to notice the distance. Connor had taken on a major infrastructure contract, a bridge expansion project on the outskirts of the city, and the hours grew longer. She understood that. She was a senior associate at her firm by then, billing her own share of late nights. They were 2 people who loved each other but kept missing each other, like trains on parallel tracks, always moving but never meeting. She told herself that was normal. She told herself a lot of things. The first sign she truly ignored was the cologne. Connor had worn the same scent since before they were married. Something woodsy, straightforward, chosen years ago, because she'd once said she liked it. Then one evening in March he came home smelling different, lighter, something citrus and expensive. She mentioned it once, casually, while they were doing dishes. He said a colleague had recommended it. She let it go. She was good at letting things go. The second sign was the phone. He'd always left it face up on the coffee table, or plugged in on the kitchen counter overnight. Small habits she'd never thought about until they changed. By April, the phone went everywhere with him. Upstairs when he changed. Into the bathroom when he showered. Face down at dinner. She told herself he was just more conscious of it now. A lot of people were. She was reading too much into ordinary things. She was a property lawyer. She should have known better than to sign something without reading it carefully. The third sign was a Tuesday afternoon in early May, when she came home from a client meeting 2 hours earlier than expected, and found Connor on the back deck, speaking quietly into his phone. He didn't hear her come in. She stood in the kitchen and watched him through the glass door, the way he was turned away from the house, shoulders hunched, one hand pressed flat against the railing. He laughed once, low and private, the way a person laughs when they're trying not to be heard. She'd heard him laugh thousands of times. This wasn't the laugh she knew. He came inside 5 minutes later and said he'd been talking to his project manager about a delay on the bridge contract. She nodded. She made dinner. She didn't sleep well that night, but she told herself that was just work stress. Then she found the hotel receipt. It wasn't dramatic. There were no texts, no lipstick, no confrontational moment in a restaurant. It was simply a printed receipt that had fallen out of the breast pocket of his blazer when she picked it up to hang it in the closet. One night, a hotel on King Street West. The kind of place you book when you want something to feel like it means something. The date was a Thursday in April. The same Thursday he'd told her he was in Hamilton for a site inspection and wouldn't be back until the following morning. She stood in their bedroom with that receipt in her hand for a long time. Then she put it in her desk drawer, went downstairs, and watched television for 2 hours without absorbing a single thing on the screen. She didn't confront him. Not then. And people would ask her later, her sister, her friend Paulette, eventually even her lawyer, why not? Why didn't you say something right away? And the honest answer, the one she had to sit with for a long time before she could say it out loud, was this: she wasn't ready. She didn't know yet what she was going to do. And she had learned enough from her professional life to know that you do not make a move until you understand the full picture. You do not show your hand before you know what game is being played. So she waited. She watched. She started paying attention in a way she hadn't before. Connor's colleague, the one who had recommended the new cologne, was a woman named Tara Voss. Vera had met her once, briefly, at a firm event the previous autumn. Tara was 32, a junior project manager, sharp and confident, and the kind of beautiful that made a room reorganize itself slightly. Vera had shaken her hand and thought nothing of it. She was thinking about it now. Over the following weeks, Vera noticed the name appearing in Connor's calendar on the shared household app they used for scheduling. Meetings, late calls. A Saturday site visit that she'd assumed was routine. She started cross-referencing. She was very good at cross-referencing. By June, she had a clear enough picture that she finally allowed herself to see it. She made an appointment with a family lawyer named Rachel Oduya, a woman she knew professionally, but had never had cause to consult personally. Rachel had a small, calm office near Yonge and Eglinton. Vera sat across from her and laid out the facts without crying, because she had spent the drive over reminding herself that this was now a problem to be solved. She could cry later, she would cry later, but right now she needed to think. Rachel listened, asked several precise questions, and then said, "Let's talk about the matrimonial home." The house was the core of it. They had bought it 6 years ago. A 3-bedroom semi-detached in Leslieville. Modest by some standards, but chosen carefully, with a small backyard and a kitchen that got morning light. Vera had contributed 60% of the down payment from an inheritance she'd received from her grandmother. The mortgage was in both names, but the property records, if examined, told a story that weighed in her favor. What Vera had that Connor didn't know she had was documentation. She had always been meticulous. Years of legal work had trained her to keep records, to save correspondence, to date things. She had the receipt. She had screenshots of the shared calendar. She had a credit card statement. They shared one account, showing charges at restaurants she'd never been to on evenings she'd been told he was working. She had a pattern, and a pattern in family court is not nothing. Rachel told her to hold on a little longer, get more. Do not change your behavior. Do not tip him off. She went home and made dinner. She went home and made dinner for 4 more weeks. It was the hardest thing she had ever done. Not the gathering of evidence, not the sitting with knowledge she wasn't supposed to have, not even the watching him lie to her face with the ease of someone who had been practicing. The hardest part was the evenings when he was actually present, when he poured 2 glasses of wine and asked about her day and laughed at something she said. And for a few minutes, she forgot why she was counting down. Then she'd remember. And something in her chest would shift quietly, like a door closing. She gave herself a deadline, the first week of August. In July, Connor told her he'd been offered a significant promotion, a senior director role that would come with a substantial raise and a company vehicle. He told her over dinner, smiling the way he used to smile before things became complicated. She smiled back and said she was proud of him. She even meant it, in a strange, removed way. She was proud of the person he used to be, and the lines had blurred enough that the feeling carried over. She was careful not to let that confuse her. What she didn't tell him was that she had, earlier that same week, put in an application for a senior position at a different firm. A role she'd been quietly courting for months. One that came with a significant salary increase, and crucially, a fresh professional identity that had nothing to do with Connor Ashby's wife. On the morning of August 7th, a Wednesday, Connor left for work at 7:45. He kissed her on the cheek. She said, "Have a good day." She watched the car back out of the driveway and waited until it turned the corner. Then she called her sister. Then she called Rachel. Then she called the moving company she had quietly booked 2 weeks earlier. She was not running. She wanted to be clear about that, even to herself. Vera Calloway did not run from things. She had consulted her lawyer. She had secured temporary housing, a furnished apartment in the annex that a colleague was subletting, and she had made arrangements. She was not fleeing. She was executing a plan she had thought through carefully, deliberately, and completely. She simply hadn't announced it. By 11 in the morning, the things that were hers were boxed and gone. She had not taken anything that wasn't hers. She had left a note, 3 sentences, measured and unambiguous, on the kitchen counter beside the coffee maker. "I know. I've spoken to a lawyer. You'll be hearing from her." She locked the door behind her, put her key through the mail slot, and walked to her car. She drove to the annex without crying. She made it all the way up to the 3rd floor, down the hallway, through the door of the furnished apartment, all the way to the window overlooking the street, before she finally stopped holding herself together. Then she sat down on the floor because there was nowhere else she wanted to be in that moment, and she let herself feel every single thing she'd been storing up for months. It took about 20 minutes. Then she washed her face, unpacked her kettle, and made tea. Connor called 17 times that evening. She did not answer. He sent 14 texts. She read them all and replied to none. He showed up at the building at 9 o'clock. She didn't know how he'd found the address, and she'd have to address that later. And she watched from the window as he stood on the sidewalk below, looking up at a building he didn't know well enough to enter. He called again. She watched her phone light up on the windowsill and didn't move. He left at 9:45. The next morning, she received an email from him that was 3 pages long. She forwarded it to Rachel. Rachel, for her part, moved efficiently. The formal separation notice went out within the week. Connor retained his own lawyer, a man named Stuart Bledsoe, who Vera knew by reputation as someone who liked to delay proceedings and make the other side tired. He was not going to get tired. She had made herself a promise about that. The initial settlement discussions were predictably unpleasant. Connor's position, as communicated through Stuart Bledsoe, was that the matrimonial home should be sold and the proceeds split equally. He argued that his income over the past several years had funded the lifestyle that allowed Vera to take on less billable work when she chose to. This was technically not false, but it was framed in a way that erased the 60% down payment, the inheritance, the property research she had done, the refinancing she had negotiated at a better rate than their original broker had offered. She had the records. Rachel had the records. Stuart Bledsoe's framing did not survive first contact with documentation. There was also the question of conduct. Rachel had advised her, early on, that evidence of infidelity rarely changes the financial outcome of a separation in Ontario. The family law framework is largely no fault, but what it does do, what it very specifically does, is establish context for certain decisions. Why did Vera leave the matrimonial home voluntarily? Why did she not negotiate from within the home? Because she was responding to a situation she had not created, and had chosen to exit with her dignity intact. Rachel made this point clearly in the first formal exchange. Stuart Bledsoe did not respond to it directly, which told them both something. Vera started her new position in mid-September. The role was everything she'd hoped, intellectually demanding, well-resourced, and full of people who did not know her as Connor Ashby's wife. She was simply Vera Calloway, senior associate, the one who had moved quickly on the Harborfront file and had an efficient habit of getting things done. She liked that. She liked it very much. She did not date. She was not ready to date. She was not even thinking about dating. What she did do was start running again. She had given it up somewhere in the middle years of the marriage, along the waterfront in the early mornings before work. She had forgotten how much she needed it. The hearing was scheduled for late October. She had not spoken to Connor directly since the morning he found her at the apartment. They had sat across from each other once, briefly, at a preliminary case conference in September, and she had been careful to look past him to a fixed point on the wall behind his head. Not out of hostility, out of self-protection. There was a version of Connor that she still, in some dim and irrational part of her, missed. She could not afford to look at him too directly. Stuart Bledsoe arrived at the October hearing with a revised position and an air of someone who expected things to go his way. Connor sat in a gray suit she didn't recognize. New, she thought, probably bought for the occasion. Tara Voss was not present. She had not been mentioned officially at any point in the proceedings. She was a fact that both sides knew, and neither had formally introduced. Vera found this almost darkly funny. Rachel presented the financial record cleanly and without theater. The down payment, the inheritance documentation, the mortgage records, the property valuation. She also presented, carefully and without editorializing, the credit card statements and the hotel receipt, not as evidence of moral failing, but as evidence of a pattern of expenditure from a joint account on activities Vera had not been informed of, and which had occurred during the period of marriage. Connor's lawyer objected. The objection was noted. The record was admitted. The mediator, a quiet, experienced woman named Justice Bernadette Stoll. Listened to both sides without interrupting. She asked 2 questions of Vera directly. Had she been coerced in any way when she vacated the matrimonial home, and was she represented by counsel throughout the process? Vera said no to the first and yes to the second. Justice Stoll recessed for 90 minutes. When she returned, her recommendation was clear. Vera would retain 60% of the net proceeds from the sale of the matrimonial home, consistent with her documented contribution to the down payment. Connor would retain his pension and vehicle. The remaining assets, joint savings, household goods, would be divided equally. Neither party would pay spousal support to the other, given their comparable professional incomes. Stuart Bledsoe spoke quietly to Connor for several minutes. Connor's face was difficult to read. Vera kept her eyes on her notepad, where she had written nothing. Connor accepted the terms. She signed her copies in Rachel's office 2 days later. Rachel brought coffee. It was a gray November afternoon, the kind that arrives in Toronto and makes no apologies about it. And Vera sat at the conference table and worked through the stack of documents methodically, the way she worked through everything. When the last page was signed, Rachel said, "That's it," and Vera nodded. She drove home through the early dark. The annex apartment had become, in 4 months, something that felt almost like hers. The kettle on the counter, the books on the windowsill, the specific quality of the morning light that she had gotten used to. She made dinner. She ate it standing up at the kitchen counter, which was a habit she'd never been allowed to have when she was married, because Connor had opinions about eating at the table. She ate standing at the counter and thought about what she was going to do next. Not with a man, not with her career, that was sorted, not with any of the large structural things, just next. Tomorrow, the week after. She had gotten so skilled, over the past several months, at thinking in terms of strategy and documentation and forward motion that she had slightly lost the habit of simply deciding what she wanted. She wanted to call her sister, so she did. She wanted to sleep a full 8 hours, so she did that too. She wanted, eventually, on a Saturday morning in early December, to go back to the vineyard where she'd been married. Not to grieve it, not even to revisit it, but because she'd heard they'd opened a new tasting room, and she'd been meaning to try their Riesling, and she refused to let a memory be the reason she didn't go somewhere she wanted to go. She drove out on her own in the cold, clear morning, along the highway that opens up past Hamilton into the flat winter farmland of the Niagara Peninsula. She found the vineyard, she found the tasting room, she sat at a small wooden table by a window that looked out over bare rows of dormant vines. A young woman brought her a flight of 4 wines and explained each one with quiet enthusiasm. Vera listened. She tasted. She asked a question about the aging process that the young woman wasn't sure how to answer but appreciated being asked. She bought 2 bottles, wrapped in tissue in a small paper bag, and put them in the back seat. She drove home in the late afternoon light, and she was fine. Not the performed version of fine, not the version she had assembled carefully to present to the world while her marriage was falling apart. The actual version, the one that doesn't need to announce itself, the one that just is. She was 38 years old, and she was a person again, rather than one half of something that had stopped working. She would carry some of this for a long time. She was honest enough to know that. The years weren't nothing. The mornings weren't nothing. The kitchen smell of dark roast that she still sometimes noticed, even now, in coffee shops that had nothing to do with him. But she had her name on the documents that mattered. She had her work. She had her apartment and her running shoes, and her sister's number in her phone, and 2 bottles of very good Riesling in the back seat. It was enough. It was, she decided, turning onto the highway toward home, more than enough to start with.